with KSDE. And today we're going to go over, is this meal reimbursable, the breakfast version. So tomorrow morning we'll have the lunch version, but today we're going to cover breakfast. And so let's go ahead and get started. I'm happy you guys could all join us today. So our objectives for this class are that participants by the end of this class will be able to recognize a reimbursable meal, because recognizing and serving reimbursable breakfasts is very important to our program integrity. So by the end of the class, we want to be able to learn what comprises a reimbursable breakfast meal, practice recognizing reimbursable breakfast meals, identify methods for communicating reimbursable breakfasts, and then explore innovative ways to deliver our reimbursable breakfast meals. So we'll cover those 4 main points this morning. Oh, and Emily asked if I could present slideshow. Whenever I do that, it takes over both of my screens and I can't see anything else. So this is the only workaround I've been able to find. Hopefully it's big enough. Can you guys all see it though? So our modules today, we've got 4 main modules. What does reimbursable mean? Recognizing reimbursable breakfast at the point of service is Module 2, and we'll have some activities related to that. Module 3 is communicating a reimbursable breakfast meal. And then Module 4 is the innovative breakfast delivery, some different models for delivering breakfast. So let's get started with our introduction. So our intro is on the nutrition standards for the school breakfast program. And your nutrition standards for school meals consist of the required food components with daily and weekly minimums and dietary specifications for calories, saturated fat, trans fat, and sodium. And your nutrition standards for school meals are based upon the current dietary guidelines for Americans. And the dietary guidelines are revised every 5 years based upon an extensive review of the most current nutrition and health research. So you can know that the meal standards for your school meals are based on lots of research in nutrition and health. As you guys all know, I'm sure, breakfast is very important, and research has confirmed that eating a breakfast meal to start the day is important. Studies show that children who eat a nutritionally balanced school breakfast are more likely to reach higher levels of achievement in reading and math. They have better concentration skills, are more alert, and retain more of what is learned, and are more participative in class. School data shows a correlation with breakfast consumption and reduced absenteeism, reduced tardiness, reduced behavior problems, reduced nurses' office visits, increased standardized test achievement scores, higher grades, and a positive learning environment. So as we've seen, breakfast is super important, and that's why it's important that we're serving our kids a healthy meal and making sure as many students as possible have access to that breakfast meal. So that healthy breakfast meal that we're serving consists of 3 components, and these are grains, fruit, and milk. So we'll talk a lot about those 3 components today during this training. But here we have an example of a breakfast tray where the 3 components are represented on this tray. So the first components we talked about is the grain component, and in school meals, at least 50% of the total grains offered during the week must be whole grain rich. And for a grain to be considered whole grain, at least 50% of the grain ingredient content must come from whole grains. And a whole grain rich product can be identified by looking at the first grain ingredient on the ingredient list, referring to a product's whole grain rich stamp, or obtaining a product formulation statement from the manufacturer. And I would say probably the most common one of those methods to identify a whole grain rich product is looking at that first grain ingredient, but know that there are 3 options for identifying that. and a school nutrition program may offer MeatMeat Alternate options in place of the grains after the minimum daily grain requirement is met. So what this means is you can serve a MeatMeat Alternate and consider it a grain, but it has to be at least 1 ounce of MeatMeat Alternate, and you have to have already served 1 ounce of actual grain items. And we'll talk about that. That's a little bit confusing, but we'll talk about it more in some of our activities and in future modules. So our second component is the fruit component, and the fruit component can include fruit that is fresh, canned, frozen, or dried, and 100% fruit and vegetable juice can also be offered on a limited basis. So you just can't serve, no more than 50% of the fruit servings offered over the course of the week can be from fruit or vegetable juice. Vegetables can be offered to meet all or part of the fruit requirement. It's just that the first 2 cups per week of any such substitution has to come from the dark green, red orange, bean peas, and other vegetable subgroups. And full strength fruit or vegetable juice may be offered to meet up to 1/2 of that weekly fruit requirement, as we discussed. So USDA has allowed some flexibility in terms of that substitution of vegetables for fruits. And so you can credit any vegetables as a substitute for fruit, but note that this is only effective through September 30th of 2019. So you can, school nutrition programs can credit any vegetable, including potatoes and other starchy vegetables, in place of fruit without including those other vegetable subgroups we talked about in the previous slide. But just note that this added flexibility is only effective through September 30th of 2019. So you'll just want to carefully weigh the advantages and disadvantages of including this flexibility on that temporary basis until September 30th. So our third and final component is the milk component for the school breakfast program. And at least 2 varieties of fluid milk must be offered at meal service, with at least 1 variety being unflavored. So you've got to offer 2 options at breakfast, and one of those has to be an unflavored option. So this could be a combination of 1% white, fat-free white, 1% flavored, and fat-free flavored. So now that we have figured out what our 3 components are, we can look at our daily and weekly requirements. So your breakfast meals for grades K through 8 include daily and weekly minimum requirements as listed on this chart in the slide. And it's the responsibility of the menu planner to make sure that each component is provided in the minimum amount for each of your age grade groups. So if we look at this chart, you'll notice that there are some similarities between the K through 5 pattern in those, the second and third columns, and the 6 through 8 pattern in the third and fourth columns. So since there are no grain maximums at breakfast, you could simplify the menu planning to combine K through 5 and 6 through 8 into one K through 8 breakfast menu that would have a calorie range of 400 to 500 calories. So if you look at column 2, the K through 5 daily minimums, those are exactly the same as column 4, where we've got the 6 through 8 daily minimums. So they all need 1 cup of fruit or vegetable or juice, 1 ounce equivalent of grains, and 1 cup of milk. And again, as we talked about, there's no MeatMeat Alternate requirement at breakfast. So then if we compare their weekly minimums, you can see that the only difference is those bold amounts in the grains. K through 5 just needs 7 ounce equivalents per week, and 6 through 8 needs 8 ounce equivalents per week. So you could offer a K through 8 breakfast meal pattern where you're going to get 8 ounce equivalents for the entire week because there's no maximums on grains. And then just remember that 50% or more of all the grains offered during the week must be whole grain rich, and at least 2 varieties of milk have to be offered, and one of these varieties has to be unflavored. So now here we've added grades 9 through 12. Their meal pattern is listed on this slide. So you can see we are comparing the 9 through 12 daily and weekly minimums in columns 2 and 3 to the K through 12 in those last 2 columns. And again, you'll see that the daily fruit, milk, and grain requirements for K through 8 and 9 through 12 are the same, and the weekly total for grains are slightly higher for the secondary grade groups. So menu planners who provide breakfast meals for grades K through 12 can provide consistent, predictable breakfast menus by offering a breakfast menu that provides 1 cup of fruit, 1 cup milk choice, and 2 ounce equivalents grains for each daily menu offered. So that means regardless of the grade, K through 12, you're going to offer 2 ounce equivalents of grains daily so that you're at least meeting that 9 through 12 weekly minimum of 9 ounce equivalents of grains. So that can help you. That's one way to simplify your menu planning. For breakfast, you can have the same meal pattern for all grades, K through 12, at breakfast. So we touched on how MeatMeat Alternate is not a separate requirement at breakfast, but menu planners can offer MeatMeat Alternate as a grain at breakfast as the second grain option. And a breakfast meal must always offer at least 1 ounce equivalent grains, and as we discussed, 50% or more of the grains offered during the week of breakfast must be whole grain rich. And menu planners may offer a MeatMeat Alternate in place of part of the grain requirement and credit the meat toward the grain component. Menu planners can also offer MeatMeat Alternate as an extra and choose not to credit it towards the component requirements. And then in the latter case, they would be extras offered outside of the reimbursable meal but would still count toward dietary specifications. So if you are serving a meat component at breakfast, you basically have 2 options. Number 1, if it's at least 1 ounce equivalent and you've already met the 1 ounce equivalent of actual grains requirement, then you can credit it towards your weekly grain requirements. Or you can just offer it as an extra food, but just know, although it's not counting as a component, it's going to count towards your dietary specifications. All right, so now we've got an introduction regarding our reimbursable meals. Now we're going to get into what does a reimbursable meal actually mean. And Module 1 clarifies the meaning of reimbursable as it applies to school nutrition programs. A reimbursable breakfast meal is a meal that can be claimed for a specific amount of reimbursement from the school breakfast program. A reimbursable meal contains the minimum amount required by the school breakfast program to meet minimum meal standards. So basically, when we say reimbursable meal, that means it meets the minimum standards to be able to receive that federal and state reimbursement. Recognizing and claiming reimbursable meals matters to our school nutrition programs, and school nutrition programs receive money from the federal and state governments for every meal they serve to students that meet requirements. Reimbursements are received for free, reduced, and paid meals that meet the minimum requirement for reimbursement. And reimbursable breakfast meals also matter to students. Your planned breakfast meals are sold as a unit regardless of what the student selects. If a student were to select a reimbursable meal, their account is charged the unit meal price regardless of what they got. However, if a student fails to select a reimbursable meal, the items selected are charged to their account individually as part of the Smart Snacks a la carte option. Taking a reimbursable meal is the most economical way to get daily nourishment at school because it ensures that students are charged the unit price for the meal, and then you, as a district, will get your reimbursement for that meal. So that's why it's so important that staff are trained on recognizing a reimbursable meal. So we're going to talk about two different options for serving our breakfast, and there's the serve program and then there's offer versus serve. So first we'll discuss serve, and schools must always offer all three food components and at least the minimum daily requirements. So regardless of if you're serve or offer versus serve, you must provide those three components: your grains, fruit, and milk. Students in schools operating a serve program are required to take all of the components and the amounts required by the breakfast meal pattern. So while students must take all food items, they are not required to eat all of the food items served. School nutrition programs are permitted to operate a serve style of service at breakfast for all their grades K through 12. So again, in a serve program, you're offering at least those three components in the required amounts, and then students have to take all of those components. They're not required to eat them, but they must take all of the components. And one thing about serve programs is that they tend to have higher food costs since all of the menu items must be served and taken. There's also often more waste in a serve style since customers are required to take items they may not want to consume. And serve programs can also create dissatisfaction since customers cannot choose the foods they prefer to eat. So it's just some things to remember if you are considering a serve program. So here we'll look at a sample menu for a serve breakfast. So this example of a breakfast menu in a serve program meets the daily and weekly requirements for breakfast. So you'll see we've got the three required components on the left: 1 cup fruit, 1 to 2 ounce equivalents grains, and 1 cup milk. And then we've got the planned menu. So we've got applesauce, grape juice, cereal, muffin, and milk. And with all those items, all 5 of those items, students have to take every one of those items. If a child doesn't like grape juice, they still have to take the grape juice because it is a serve program. So now we'll switch gears to offer versus serve at breakfast. And implementing offer versus serve style of service allows student customers to decline a portion of the offered meal. So an offer versus serve program allows students to choose the foods they prefer to eat, which in turn reduces food waste. And when students understand the rules for an offer versus serve style of service, they are easily able to select a reimbursable meal. So it takes some practice, but once students get it down, it's pretty easy to identify a reimbursable meal. So if a sponsor is implementing offer versus serve at breakfast, they must offer students at least 4 food items in amounts meeting the breakfast meal pattern. Students must select at least 3 of the offered food items, 1 of which must be a half cup of fruit or vegetable. Nutrition program staff cannot require students to take specific items other than that half cup of fruit or vegetable, as long as at least 3 items are selected. At breakfast, student customers are not required to take the main dish menu item or milk as one of their minimum number of menu items. While the half cup of fruit is required, the student can choose the other offered menu items to comprise 3 or more menu items on their plate. While optional, school nutrition programs are strongly encouraged to operate an offer versus serve style of breakfast for all of their grades K through 12. So if we compare that to the serve breakfast that we just discussed, serve, they had to take all of the components, every item you offered. With offer versus serve, they just have to take at least a half cup of fruit or vegetable and 2 other items. So a total of 3 items. So some definitions before we dig into offer versus serve a little bit more. For the purposes of school nutrition programs, there's a distinction between components and menu items. A menu item is a specific food offered within the food component. So a menu item would be 1 apple, 1 muffin. And the component is basically that food group that the item falls under. So for purposes of implementing offer versus serve, a menu item is the daily required minimum amount of each food component that a child can take. So the 3 items listed below would be 1 cup of milk would be a menu item falling under that milk component. An item that is 1 ounce equivalent of grains or MeatMeat Alternate, you have that item that falls under the component of grains. And then same thing with the fruit or vegetable. The component is the fruit group, and then that specific fruit is the item. So here we've got an offer versus serve breakfast menu. And menus in offer versus serve are described by component content and also by the item. So in this sample menu, each menu item is the minimum amount a student could select. In other words, a student could not select less than one bowl pack of cereal or less than 1 8-ounce carton of milk. So they've got to select that entire item for it to count as one item. To select the minimum amount of items required for this breakfast to be reimbursable, the student would select half cup of fruit or juice, and 2 additional items. So again, we can see they've met the 3 required components there in the left column with those 5 different menu items. And then to select a reimbursable meal, they just have to take a half cup of fruit. So they've got 2 options there up top, and then 2 additional items. So they've got 2 other options to choose from. So breaking this down by component, 1 8-ounce carton of milk meets the daily component requirement of 1 cup. And that 1 8-ounce carton of milk is going to count as 1 item that a student can take. So it's pretty easy. If a child takes a carton of milk, there's 1 item. Your fruit component can be thought of in a few different ways. 1, most breakfast menus offer at least 2 choices of fruit or fruit and fruit juice and/or vegetables, and full-strength fruit or vegetable juice may be offered to meet up to 1/2 of the weekly fruit requirement. So 1 half-cup portion of fruit would meet half of the planned 1 cup minimum daily amount. So just know, if you're serving half-cup portions, you've got to have at least 2 options available to meet that 1 cup minimum amount. But that 1 half-cup portion of fruit does meet the half-cup minimum requirement a student must select, and it's considered 1 item. So if a student just took a half-cup portion of fruit, they've met that requirement for a reimbursable meal. They just need 2 additional items. Now, a 1 cup portion of fruit meets the 1 cup planned minimum daily amount. So just know you don't have to offer 2 options of fruit at breakfast. It's encouraged to have some variety, but if you want to just offer 1 cup portion of 1 type of fruit, that is fine. And then it's up to your discretion if that counts as 1 item or 2 items. And then, as we talked about, vegetables may be offered to meet all or part of the fruit requirement, but the first 2 cups per week of any of these substitutions has to be from dark green, red orange, bean peas, and other vegetables. So now our grain component. A 1 ounce equivalent grain serving will meet the minimum daily amount of grains required. But just know that if only 1 ounce equivalent of grains is served each day of a 5-day week, the weekly grain total is not met. Because if you're only serving 1 ounce daily, multiply that by 5 days, that's only going to be 5 ounce equivalents over the week. And we've got those weekly minimum requirements to meet. So the weekly requirement for grades K through 5 is 7 ounces over the week. For 6 through 8, it's 8 ounce equivalents. And for 9 through 12, it's 9 ounce equivalents. So regardless of the age group, offering only 1 ounce daily is going to cause us to fall short for the week. A menu item that credits as 1 ounce equivalent grains is considered one item. If a 2 ounce equivalent grain serving, 2 ounce equivalent grain item is served, it will meet the minimum planned daily amount of grain component. And if a 2 ounce equivalent grain is served each day, the 10 ounce equivalent grains for the week exceeds the weekly minimum for all 3 grade groups. So if we are serving at least 2 ounces every day, then multiply that by 5, we've got 10 ounce equivalents over the week, and that meets the K through 5 weekly requirement of 7 ounces, the 6 through 8 requirement of 8 ounces, and then the 9 through 12 requirement of 9 ounces for the week. The ounce equivalent for breakfast grains is determined by dividing the finished product weight by the ounces per ounce equivalent. And ounce equivalent grains can also be determined by dividing the weight in grams of the finished product by the grams per 1 ounce equivalent value, or by using the USDA food buying guide tool. And as this chart indicates, a 1 ounce equivalent grain is also considered one item, and calculations for grains must be rounded down to the nearest 0.25 ounce equivalent. So you can see here, all of these products are about 1 ounce equivalent grains, or a little bit higher, and they all count as one item. Larger grain portions that are a minimum of 2 ounce equivalent grains can be planned as one item or 2 items, and it's up to the discretion of the menu planner to decide how to plan larger grain portions. If one portion of grains is counted as 2 items, the menu planner should provide signage for students so they understand they are selecting 2 items. So if you have a larger grain item, again, it can count as 2 items. It's just up to the menu planner's discretion. So you see here we've got a large bagel that counts as 2 ounce equivalent grains, and we can decide if we want to count that as 1 or 2 items. Same thing with the English muffin, the biscuit, the cereal, and the cereal bar. Because it's 2 ounce equivalent grains, we can decide if we want to count it as 1 or 2 items. And you just want to make sure that information is communicated to your staff who are watching for reimbursable meals, and then also to the students, so they understand if they just take a bagel and it's 2 items and a half cup of fruit, then they have a reimbursable meal. So as we discussed earlier, menu planners do have the discretion to count 1 ounce equivalent MeatMeat Alternate as 1 ounce equivalent grains at breakfast after they have met the 1 ounce equivalent grains requirement with that planned menu. So when you're counting MeatMeat Alternate as an ounce equivalent of grains, the menu planner also has the flexibility to count a breakfast portion equal to or greater than 2 ounce equivalents as 1 item or 2 items. And of course, to reduce student and staff confusion, you just want to make sure that you're consistent in how you credit your MeatMeat Alternate. So if you're always counting your meat, or if one day you count MeatMeat Alternate as an extra, I'd recommend you always count it as an extra, or be consistent so that your staff and your students understand what you're requiring. So here are some examples to kind of help understand that a little more. With a pancake sausage on a stick, the portion size is 1 each. Based on our CN label, we know that this credits as 1 ounce equivalent grains and 1 ounce equivalent MeatMeat Alternate. So with that crediting here at the top, we can count that as 1 item or 2 items. So we can say we're just going to count the grains, that's just 1 item. Or we could say we want to credit the grains and we want to credit the meat as a grain, so we'll count that as 2 items. Now if we just wanted to credit the grains, you see down here below, we're just going to count that as 1 item, and then that meat would be an extra, and it'll count towards our dietary specifications. So breakfast pizza, kind of the same thing. The serving size is 1 portion, and our CN label tells us it credits as 1 ounce equivalent grains, 1 ounce equivalent meat alternate. So again, we can choose just to credit the grains, or we can credit the grains and the meat as the grains and say it's 2 items. Or we can say, just want to credit the grains, it's just 1 item. And then the biscuit sandwich, serving size is 1 portion, and our CN label or product formulation statement tells us it credits as 2 ounce equivalent grains from the biscuit, and then the sausage or the cheese or the egg on that biscuit sandwich counts as 1 ounce equivalent meat alternate. So looking at that top section, we can say we're counting it as 1 item. It's 1 unit, we're just going to count it as 1 item. Or we're going to count it as 2 items. So we'll say we're going to count that biscuit as 2 items because it's a large grain item. Or we can say 3 items because we want to count the biscuit and the meat alternate. And that would equal 3 items. And we'll have some practice on this here in a little bit. Just remember that if you are choosing to count the meat alternate as an extra, that it does not count towards your daily or weekly minimum menu requirements, but it will count towards your weekly dietary specifications, your weekly, daily, or average of dietary specifications for calories, saturated fat, and sodium. So again, being consistent with defining your breakfast items as 1 item or more reduces confusion for your students and cashiers. And if a breakfast product is counted as more than 1 item, it should be labeled as 2 items. So here's a little activity, and I'll pull that up. So here we have a breakfast menu item activity. So just as we discussed in deciding how many items each menu item would count as, we're going to go through these and determine how many items each of these products would credit towards. So if you guys want, you can type in the chat box. Otherwise, I'll just work through this and explain it for you. So our first menu, menu 1, we have a pancake sausage on a stick, and the meat alternate is going to count as a grains. So again, it's up to your discretion if you're going to count meat alternate as a grain or not, but it's saying that it's at least 1 ounce equivalent, and we've got 1 ounce equivalent of grains from that pancake breading on this pancake sausage on a stick. So we can count that as 1 or 2 items. We can choose just to count that grain, just the pancake part. That would be 1 item. Or we can say it's a large item. We want to count both the grain and the meat, so we want it to be 2 items. Again, when you're planning your menus, you want to think about this so that, when a student comes through the line, it's not a game time decision as to whether it's counting as 1 or 2 items. You've already communicated it to everyone, including the students. Okay, so moving on to fruit, we've got 1 fresh orange and a ½ cup of fruit cocktail. If you remember, a ½ cup of fruit counts as 1 item. So these both are going to count as 1 item. And then milk is an easy one. Remember, we said an 8-ounce carton of milk is going to count as 1 item. So we'll put 1 item there. So this menu gives us either 4 or 5 items, depending on how we choose to credit that pancake sausage on a stick. And like I said, that needs to be determined as you're planning the menus and then communicated to your cashier or whoever's monitoring for reimbursable meals, and then to the students. Okay, so menu 2, we've got whole grain cereal, and it's crediting as 1 ounce equivalent grains, and a whole grain cereal bar, counting as 1 ounce equivalent grains. So these are both going to be 1 item, because if you remember, a 1 ounce equivalent grain item is going to credit as 1 item. Our fruit, we've got a 1/2 cup of diced pears and a 1/2 of a fresh apple. These are both crediting as a 1/2 cup of fruit. And what does a 1/2 cup of fruit credit as? 1 item. And then finally, we've got the milk. An 8 ounce carton of milk credits as 1 item. So this menu is giving us 5 items total. So students have quite a few options for selecting a reimbursable meal here. Menu 3. Here we've got a whole grain bagel, and this is one of those grain items that's large. So if you remember, a large grain item can credit as 1 or 2 items, depending on the menu planner's discretion. So we're going to put 1 or 2 here. So you can choose, because it's 2 ounce equivalents of grain, you can choose to credit it as 2 items, or you can choose, we're going to just say it's 1 item. It's up to you. Then we've got a 1/2 cup of sliced peaches and a 1/2 cup of frozen strawberries. These are both crediting as a 1/2 cup of fruit, and a 1/2 cup of fruit credits as 1 item. And then we've got 8 fluid ounces, a cup of milk, that credits as 1 item. So here again we've got 4 or 5 items available, depending on how we want to credit that bagel. Okay, in our final menu, we've got a sausage whole grain biscuit sandwich, and that's crediting as 2.5 ounce equivalent grains. And that 1/2 ounce is coming from MeatMeat Alternate. So I'm going to assume our biscuit is 2 ounce equivalents grain, and then our sausage is crediting as 1/2 ounce of MeatMeat Alternate. So this can credit as 1 or 2 items. So basically we're just crediting that biscuit because that MeatMeat Alternate isn't enough to count as an item. So we can either say our biscuit is going to be just 1 item, or because it's large enough, it's 2 ounce equivalents grains, we're going to count it as 2 items. And then we've got 1 banana, and 1 banana credits as a 1/2 cup of fruit, and then a 1/2 cup of grapes, which will credit as a 1/2 cup of fruit. So we've set it on the last 4. A 1/2 cup of fruit credits as 1 item. And then again, 1 cup of milk is going to credit as 1 item. So here we've got 4 or 5 items. So a student could choose the banana or a 1/2 cup of grapes, or both of those. They just have to have at least a 1/2 cup of fruit, and then they can choose 2 other items. So they've got to have a 1/2 cup of fruit plus 2 other items. Okay. So for your offer versus serve program, a reimbursable breakfast can be all of the breakfast items offered. So a student can choose every single item you offered in offer versus serve. So in that previous example, they could choose that sausage breakfast biscuit sandwich. They could choose the banana, the grapes, and the milk. They can have all of the items offered. Or the minimum is that they have to have a 1/2 cup of fruit or vegetable and at least 2 additional items. Or they could choose a 1/2 cup fruit or vegetable and 2, 3, or 4 additional items. But just remember, they have to have a minimum of 3 food items on their tray, with one of those being a 1/2 cup of fruit or vegetable. So now that we've kind of got an idea of the difference between items versus components, we are going to go through some examples, and we'll talk about how to recognize a reimbursable breakfast at the point of service. So a reimbursable breakfast meal is a meal that can be claimed for a specific amount of reimbursement for the school breakfast program. So we talked about why it's so important that our point of service understands how to recognize a reimbursable meal so that we get that federal and state reimbursement for the breakfast. So the first task is to find the half cup of fruit on the tray. This would be my first recommendation when you are trying to identify a reimbursable meal. So your canned, frozen, and cut up fresh fruit or vegetables can be served, pre-portioned and selected by the student, or presented on a food bar using the correct serving utensil. Typically, one piece of fresh fruit credits as a half cup, and the exception to this is that a fresh apple would credit as 1 cup. And again, it's up to the menu planner if they want to count a fresh apple as a half cup in 1 item or 1 cup in 2 items. Dried fruit that has moisture removed, concentrating the nutrients. So a 1/4 cup of dried fruit credits as a half cup of fruit. And I always say, if you think about raisins, if we expanded a 1/4 cup of raisins into their original form of grapes, we would probably get about a 1/2 cup of fruit. 4 ounces of 100% fruit juice is a half cup. So if you're serving fruit juice, it just has to be 4 ounces, and that meets the half cup requirement. Obviously, you'd want to serve another half cup of fruit with that to meet that 1 cup daily requirement. And again, there is a limit to how often juice can be offered over the course of the week, and all of your juices have to be 100% juice. Students who make their selections in a self-serve style may choose to combine several types of fruits and/or vegetables offered to meet the half cup requirement. And this just would require your staff member to assess the tray to determine if there's enough fruit or vegetable on the tray or in an individual bowl to meet the half cup minimum. So a student could choose a 1/4 cup of grapes and a 1/4 cup of peaches, and that would meet the half cup requirement. So again, first thing in recognizing a reimbursable meal is to look for that half cup of fruit. And again, that can be from canned or frozen or cut up fruit, 1 whole piece of fruit, a 1/4 cup dried fruit, 4 ounces of 100% fruit juice, a mixture, a combination of fruit that provides a half cup, or a half cup vegetables if we're substituting vegetables for fruit. And then the next step is to recognize those 2 additional items. And it's important to clearly communicate to point of service staff how each food item on the menu is designated as an item. So we found that half cup of fruit. Now we need to find the 2 additional items on the tray. So this could be 1 grain item plus 8 ounces of milk. It could be 2 grain items. It could be an additional fruit or vegetable item and then a grain item. Or it could be an additional fruit or vegetable item and a milk item. And again, it just needs to be consist of 3 items with 1 of those being a half cup fruit or vegetable. So now we're going to do some practice with this. We've got some sample menus. So here's our menu. Today for breakfast we are providing cereal, whole grain toast, and both of those are 1 ounce equivalent grains, a half cup of fruit cocktail, an apple, and a variety of low-fat, fat-free milk. So each of those counts as 1 item. So this is what our tray looks like. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 items with the apple, and the fruit cocktail could count as our fruit. So is this meal reimbursable? I would say yes, because we've got at least a half cup of fruit and 3 additional items. So we've got fruit, grain, and milk. So again, if we go back to those steps from before, first thing is identify that half cup of fruit. So we've definitely got that covered. And then we've got 1, 2 additional items. So we've got 4 items on the tray. We need at least 3. Is this meal reimbursable? So again, we're going to look for that half cup of fruit. We've got that covered because our apple credits as 1 cup. And then we've got two more additional items for a total of 3 items. So that is reimbursable. So here's our second menu. We've got a bagel that is 2 ounce equivalents grains, and we are saying we want to credit that large item as 2 items. We've got an apple at 1 cup, and we're crediting it as 1 item. Orange juice at a half a cup, again that's 1 item, and then our milk at 1 cup is 1 item. So is this meal, this is what our tray looks like. So our apple and juice can count as our fruit. Is this meal reimbursable? It is not, because we are missing that half cup of fruit. First thing we're looking for is the half cup of fruit. It's nowhere on here. They've got 3 items because the bagel counts as 2 plus the milk, but we don't have that fruit on the tray. What about this meal? It's a little tricky. So we've got the half cup of fruit covered. In the bagel, remember we're crediting the bagel as 2 grain items. So we've got 1, 2, 3 with the bagel. We've got 3 items on this tray. So that's why it's really important to not only communicate to your staff, but to the students that how the bagel or how those large items are crediting, so they know if a student came through with this tray, it would be reimbursable. So here's our sample menu. We've got a muffin at 1 ounce, crediting as 1 grain item. Orange juice at a half cup is 1 item. Our banana is a half cup of fruit, so it's 1 item. And then our milk is 1 item. So here's what our tray looks like. Is this meal reimbursable? Yes, it is, because we've got the half cup of fruit from the banana, and then we've got 1, 2 additional items. So we've got 3 items with at least a half cup of fruit. What about this tray? Yes, it is, because we've got at least a half cup of fruit, and then they decided to get another half cup of fruit. That's their second item, and then milk, that's their third item. So that is reimbursable. And what about this one? This one is not reimbursable because we only have 2 items on this tray. So they've got the half cup of fruit, but then they only have 1 additional item. So we're going to need to send them back to get at least 1 more item to make it a reimbursable meal. So now we've got a menu with 5 items, and we're crediting the MeatMeat Alternate as a grain. So we've got 1 ounce equivalent of MeatMeat Alternate from scrambled eggs, and we're going to say that counts as 1 grain item. Then we've got 1 ounce equivalent of grains from toast, that's a grain item, half cup of mixed fruit, half cup of orange juice, both fruit, 1 fruit item, and then our milk is an item. So here's what our tray looks like. And remember, we can only credit those eggs because we've got 1 ounce equivalent of grains from our toast. If our menu didn't have that toast, then it wouldn't be a reimbursable menu because we've got to have at least 1 ounce equivalent of actual grains before we can credit the MeatMeat Alternate. So is this meal reimbursable? They've got 3 items, but they forgot the half cup of fruit. So we've got to send them back to get a half cup of fruit. And what about this one? The answer is yes. So we've identified they have a half cup of fruit from our mixed fruit, and then they've got 2 additional items. So although the menu has to have the toast to credit the MeatMeat Alternate, if a student selects just the eggs without the toast, that can still count as an item. Okay, so now we've got the opposite. We've got MeatMeat Alternate on this menu, but we are not crediting the large boiled egg. So we're just going to count that as an extra. So when it's an extra, it cannot count as an item. And then we've got toast, an apple, orange juice, and milk, and they are all one item. So here's what our tray looks like. Is this meal reimbursable? We've got the half cup of fruit from the apple, and 2 additional items. So they've got 3 items with a half cup of fruit. That's reimbursable. How about this tray? They've got the half cup of fruit. We could count the apple or the orange juice as our half cup of fruit. And then they've got 2 additional items, so that is reimbursable. So although they doubled up on fruit, you can still count. You'll count 1 fruit as your half cup of fruit, and then 1 of them as an additional item. Now this one's tricky. So we've got an apple, toast, and the hard-boiled egg. So we've got the half cup of fruit, that's covered. The toast is an additional item, but that egg cannot be counted as an item because we're counting it as an extra. So we chose not to credit the egg towards our grain component, so it cannot count as an item. So they would need to go back and get an additional item. Okay, so now we've got this menu where we've got a combination food. So we've got an egg sandwich on an English muffin, and we are saying the 2-ounce equivalent grains from the English muffin counts as 2 grain food items, but the egg and cheese is going to count as an extra. So we're not counting the egg and cheese as an item. Then we've got an apple, orange juice, and milk, and each of those are 1 item. So here's our tray with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 items because the English muffin counts as 2. So is this tray reimbursable? That one's easy. We've learned we need to identify the half cup of fruit or vegetable, and we don't have that here, so we've got to send them back to get that half cup. They've got 3 items, but don't have that half cup of fruit or vegetable. And is this one reimbursable? Yes, it is, because we have half cup of fruit or vegetable from an apple, and then 2 other items because our English muffin is counting as 2. So 3 items on this tray. And then our final menu, we've got toast, cereal as 1 grain item each, half cup of strawberries and a half cup of orange juice, and then milk. So here's our tray. Is this meal reimbursable? The answer depends on the menu planner. So I would say yes, because we've got the half cup of orange juice and then 2 additional items. But it only depends on if the menu planner allows a student to select more than 1 selection of 1 item. So we've got a frequently asked question on that. May a student take 2 of the same grain items? And a menu planner may choose to offer 2 different 1-ounce equivalent grain items at breakfast, and a student may be allowed to take 2 of the same grain and count as 2 items. So if you offered a cup of milk, a cup of fruit, cereal, and toast, the student could select the 1 cup fruit or a half cup fruit and then 2 slices of toast. It's just up to you to decide if you're going to allow students to duplicate a menu item, take 2 of 1 menu item. And of course, you want to communicate that to the students so they know your guidelines for your menu items. And double servings of components or food items are allowed for the fruit component, the grains component, and then credited ounce equivalent meat alternate substituted for grains. But again, it's up to your discretion whether you'll allow students to take double portions of an item. Another question is, can pre-bagged or bundled meals be served under offer versus serve? And this is an acceptable plan if the menu planner chooses. Pre-plating or bundling of certain items is allowed, and if a school participates in offer versus serve at breakfast and offers breakfast where some or all of the components are bundled together, the operator should attempt to the extent possible to offer choices, such as a fruit basket, aside from the pre-bagged items. However, there is no requirement that all possible combinations of choices be made available to students. When the operator encourages variety within the bundled choices, this helps to minimize potential for food waste and increased costs. So a school could give students different plated specials where they have 3 different main dishes plus milk and fruit. Or you could bundle the grains and fruit items together and then offer a variety of milk options. So Module 3 goes into communicating a reimbursable meal at breakfast. And like we said, we want to communicate what counts as a reimbursable meal to students so they understand how to select a reimbursable meal. And menus are your main means of communicating your menu items to customers. And they're also a reminder to families that breakfast is available at school, and eating breakfast helps fuel the school day. And so your breakfast menu information could include the innovative ways a breakfast meal is made available to students, such as second chance breakfast, grab and go, or breakfast in the classroom. And then your breakfast menu information could also provide meal prices, smart snack in schools, a la carte information, nutrient analysis data, and possibly allergen notices. And in addition to posting the menu as a way to communicate meal options to students, the Kansas Food Code requires labeling of a packaged product if it is packaged on-site and presented to the customer in a self-serve style. So this just means that if a product is packaged, if it's put into a bottle, can, carton, bag, secure wrapper by the food establishment, and before it's offered for self-service, you need to provide the nutrition information to the students in some way so they understand if there's any possible allergies within that product. But a packaged product that's handed to the customer by a nutrition program staff member would not need to include labeling information, since nutrition program staff are aware of the customers who have allergies and can monitor what the customer receives in the packaging. So again, this consists of products that are packaged on-site and offered for self-service. And the Kansas Department of Ag has allowed several different options for making the labeling information available to your customers. And you could put an ingredient label on the packaged product. A sign, counter card, or posting could be placed on the product. The recipe for an item could be posted next to the product. An ingredient label for a shipping box could be displayed, or you could post a sign that indicates labeling information is available upon request. And then you'd make that information available in print form. So again, your staff need to be able to communicate what a reimbursable meal consists of. So, and they need to be able to understand what a reimbursable meal looks like. So sponsors are encouraged to conduct trainings with their staff, and staff should be able to assist students when making component selections in the required amounts to ensure the meal is reimbursable. And you'll want to use production records as an internal tool to communicate how menu items contribute to the meal pattern. And then each menu item should have portion sizes so that your staff and students understand how much is required to be taken to meet requirements. And then you want your students to understand what consists of a reimbursable meal. So sponsors implementing an offer versus serve style of service should communicate what menu items comprise a reimbursable meal near or at the beginning of the serving line. And the most common way that schools do this is with the Healthy Kansas plate poster, where you would list all your menu items on the poster and put them in their corresponding food group under their component. You could also promote your program by posting menus at the school office, on bulletin boards, and sending them to classroom teachers, putting them on your district website or Facebook page, placing a display tray at the beginning of the serving line, and then maybe announcing your breakfast menu during morning announcements. And we always say, make it easy for students to select a reimbursable meal. So simplify your portion sizes to a half cup or 1 cup so it's easy for them to get that half cup requirement. Again, use signage to communicate your portions. Offer several types of fruits or vegetables throughout the service area, and then have ready access to a fruit component at the point of sale. So if a student came up without that half cup of fruit or vegetable, your cashier or point of service person could just have a selection of fruit for them to choose from. And then for grains, they come in many shapes and sizes and packages, so make sure you have a variety available, but it's easy for students to select that 1 ounce equivalent of grains. And signage can help communicate which grains credit as 1 menu item and which credit as 2 menu items. And also if your MeatMeat Alternate is counting as a grain. So this final section we'll just go through quickly is innovative breakfast delivery. And we just want you guys to be aware that there are different methods for serving breakfast. That might be grab and go, second chance breakfast, or breakfast in the classroom. And you're going to have those same minimum daily component requirements, that 1 cup fruit, 1 cup milk, and 1 ounce equivalent of grains. And again, going back to that pre-bundling, you could pre-bundle items, you could individually package them and send them in bulk to classrooms or your grab and go locations. And again, if you're offer versus serve, they're not required to eat all of the served items. So they just have to have that half cup of fruit or vegetable plus 2 other items. And that would be in this offer versus serve model. So again, offer versus serve have to meet the minimum daily component requirements, but they just have to take the half cup of fruit or vegetable plus 2 other items. And then in serve, they would have to take all of the items, but again, they're not required to eat all of them. So we have lots of great innovative breakfast delivery models across Kansas, and here are some examples. Here it looks like we've got grab and go going on, or a second chance model going on in these districts. In the top right, it looks like they're delivering meals to a classroom, and then here we've got students eating breakfast meals in their classroom. So if you are interested in an innovative breakfast delivery model, we always say feel free to reach out to your consultant or the Topeka office, and we're happy to provide some guidance on that. So in summary, as we talked about, it's important to know what comprises a reimbursable breakfast meal, explore innovative ways to deliver your breakfast. You'll want to communicate your breakfast options to student customers, and then stay informed and ask clarifying questions if you have any regarding reimbursable breakfast meals. And thank you guys all for attending the webinar. We do have a survey here. You can go to the link on this slide. I'll try to copy it in the chat box, or you can take a picture of that QR code, and it should take you straight to the link, to the survey link. And I'll stay on for a little while if you have any questions. Thank you.